Okay, we do have a big agenda today, and we hope to get a lot of questions from everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first off, thank you so much for joining our Train and Build webinar series. We are excited to kick it off with our first webinar today. We're calling it Call an Expert, the Budget Edition, which we'll get into a little bit of what that exactly means. But the short version is we're here to answer any and all budget questions that you may have today. And just to start with some quick introductions, so my name is Nicole Bruecker. I am a Senior Director here at Elevate Clinical Research Solutions. I've been in clinical research for about a decade now, mostly on the site side and mostly in startup, but I've also worked on the CRO side in startup as well and have some vendor experience. So I kind of have some unique perspectives on kind of the full array of clinical research. Prior to working in clinical research, I had direct clinical roles and roles in finance as well. So I'm excited to be talking to everyone today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alex for an introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex, Manager of Research Services here. For some background, I started my career processing the payments for clinical trials. And as you all know, that can be very much a headache. And then I made the move to a position where I was doing coverage analyses, budget negotiations on behalf of the sites. From there, I moved to the CRO side to get a different perspective on the process, where I was creating the sponsored budget templates, providing estimates to sponsors, and helped resolve any issues that would arise during the negotiation phase. And while I gained some valuable experience there on the CRO side, I'm definitely glad to be back working with the sites.
Yes, agree with that. I think we're both grateful for our experiences, but we were both chomping at the bit to be working with sites again, as we both really genuinely enjoy collaborating with sites. So to start off, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just for those of you who might be new to Elevate Clinical Research Solutions, did just want to highlight really quickly sort of overall company goals and kind of how we aim to operate in terms of our partnerships with sites. In terms of kind of key points here, I think the big thing really is that we strive to be an extension of sites teams. Our ideal situation is kind of working hand in hand, collaborating, meeting sites where they are, helping them achieve goals. And kind of with that, hopefully in our introductions, you can see we both come with a lot of experience. We have, a lot of different types of knowledge, broad industry experience that we can kind of bring to the table to provide quality services, leveraging our expertise and really focusing on serving site goals. So not, corporate goals, general company goals, things like that, really focused on your site specifically. And with that, I would say a kind of key feature as well is for the sites that we work with, having a dedicated player coach. So what that means in this case is, between Alex and myself, I couldn't even guess how many CAs, budgets, CTMS builds, all of that we've done. It's a very high number, I can tell you that. So we've kind of, been there, done that, understand the details and the nuances of the services, but also have had a lot of time guiding clients, guiding internal teams, kind of seeing that big picture. So, we can kind of bring both of those aspects to the table. In terms of our services as a company, so today we're going to be talking about Train and Build, which is one of our specialized services. In terms of other specialized services, we have Revenue Protection, which is a comprehensive AR financial service. We have staffing that we do in addition to traditional startup services, so CA, budget, contract, CTMS. In terms of this webinar series and kind of why we're here today, it really is focused on Train and Build, which in terms of developing this service, it really was created by sites ultimately. And speaking with sites today and kind of their goals and what they're looking to do, some of us that have been in the industry for a long time, kind of found it interesting, whereas before the conversations were convincing sites as to why they should do a CA, which at this point might make some of you chuckle a little bit to see kind of how far the industry has come. And today, it's sites understand it. They have teams internally that are doing it. Maybe they're doing a mix of things in terms of how they're achieving these services. But we found a lot of sites are kind of looking for more of a hybrid model these days in terms of, whether it's most of their services are outsourcing or just some, they're looking to have knowledge in-house to be able to do the services, because maybe before, they were partnering externally and they felt like their site goals weren't being met. Or kind of conversely, maybe they're now trying to bring in-house, or they were before, but in doing so, they can see, there's some gaps in knowledge. And just in terms of kind of getting that knowledge and that program foundation set up, I think some challenges there are in terms of options that are available. There's a lot of great industry conferences, and we are a big fan of that. We're very knowledge driven, love learning at any opportunity that we can. But for an individual site, trying to get that broad knowledge and apply it specifically for your site can be challenging. And when you're, at a certain conference, you're learning that conference provider's way of doing CAs, which may or may not fully make sense for your institution, your policies, your processes. And then even site to site, there's important differences in terms of how you're operating. And so I wouldn't expect every site to be doing CA budget contract the same way. And then in terms of, consulting, often there's a set start time, end time. And then after that, you're kind of left to your own devices to kind of deal with challenges as they arise. So really what we're looking to do is kind of meet sites where they are in terms of their goals, their challenges, their needs, and really offer a customized solution, not only in terms of how we're training, the methods, the scope of the training, services that we're training on, but even to the extent of the training material and playbooks that we develop, working hand in hand with sites to do it so it's a site-specific solution that's being offered, in terms of customizing it, delivering the training. But then another kind of key aspect about that I alluded to in terms of consulting is even after the training's done, not leaving you on your own to then, deal with challenges as they may arise. Of course, things come up in research constantly. So we have what's called call an expert service, which is basically, we're just a phone call or an email away. It's people like Alex and myself that are here to kind of support you even after the training's done, sort of as an insurance policy, just having kind of experts available to you at all times. So with that, kind of set the stage a little bit in terms of today. Our goal is just to kind of give you a preview, if you will, of what call an expert could be like, for a site. Like I said, Alex and I have a lot of experience, both site side, CRO side, definitely in the budget side of things. So we're looking to kind of, as much as possible, sort of stay on topic on budgets. But the nice thing about Train and Build is even if we were to do training for your site on budgets, we're also CA experts, so we can answer questions on CAs as well. But we are doing a bit of a themed webinar, so we're trying to get your budget questions. And just in terms of kind of framing what these questions might be, I kind of think of it as, the things that go bump in the night. Maybe it's just me, but every now and then, you have that 2 a.m. wake up kind of panic of, what about this? And I am fortunate because I work with Elevate Clinical Research Solutions. So when I have those panic moments, I just call up Alex or one of my other colleagues and just say, let's talk about this. Have we thought about this? So it's just kind of nice to have someone to talk to when you do kind of have those things that keep you up at night, or maybe you're just looking for someone to give you general guidance, to brainstorm with you, to problem solve. Maybe things are normally pretty smooth for you. We can all dream. But lately you've had a really challenging situation or something that you just kind of want help on. So that's kind of what we're looking to do today is, get questions from you guys. We did get questions in advance as well, so we'll cover those. But we're hoping in terms of live questions, you can see at the top of the application, there should be a questions area where you can submit your questions. So basically the goal is today is to answer as many questions as we can and just kind of have it an open forum for you guys to raise anything that you would want some expert help on as it relates to budgets. So with that, we will open the floor. Please go ahead and start submitting your questions, and Alex and I will kind of take turns a little bit in terms of addressing questions that we see in the question box. So to get us started, I'll start with a question that we did get in advance. And it is, what are your recommendations on assessing a study with a low budget and determining how to move forward? So in terms of that question, I'm kind of thinking about two things, sort of the upfront part of it, and then kind of later on. So, when you're getting your initial study documents and you're going through and you're doing your review, if you notice right away looking at the budget, like we are way far off. These are not even remotely going to cover our costs. It's kind of a good time to assess the situation, get the facts kind of on your end, and make sure you have kind of the full picture of the study, and then kind of plan from there. If it's a really small budget, and let's say it's a really small sponsor that you think, oh, maybe they kind of have limited funds and that's why, or just really in general, I would say it's good to try to get a phone call right off the bat in that situation. I definitely wouldn't recommend marking up the budget, sending back a budget that's maybe 5 times what it was to begin with, and not acknowledging that you're doing that, because it's just going to set things off in a bad tone. And with that, I would say it's helpful to have that conversation, because Alex and I will probably hit on this several times. In general, a phone call goes a long way for a variety of reasons, but if you can upfront try to get a better understanding of what's actually going to be possible. Is this a situation where we're going to get to where we need to be? And if not, kind of delicately having the conversation to try to get to the point of what's the sponsor's best and final offer. So you can on your side, kind of consider that in terms of other factors. Of course, we want to have a strong budget, but it could be a very clinically significant study. It could be a high important study for your PI, or maybe they're a lead PI in the study. So there's other things to think about with that. In terms of the phone call too, I would say it's good to allow for some creativity if you can. So maybe the sponsor isn't willing to do much on the per patient budget, but admin fees, they'll take anything. I had a study like that where we didn't quite get to where we wanted to with a per patient budget, but we got it as best we could. But admin fees were everything that was asked for, and then some to kind of help offset the cost. So trying to look at the big picture with that. I would also say just being upfront and transparent in this situation. From the sponsor side, they're of course going to be assessing things as well. They, of course, they think that you're a fabulous site and they want to work with you. That's just a given. But they've already gone through site selection, feasibility. They want to work with you. They're planning on getting your subjects in the trial. So, they have to kind of consider all that, but they might be limited, in terms of their funding. So if you can just be upfront about, this is what we need to make the study work. We're motivated to do it. If you have kind of additional sort of ammo that you can use to sell your site a little bit, like we have 3 patients that we have identified already for this trial that we're going to move forward, or we have a great pre-screening process and marketing process. We know we'll get a lot of patients in. Just kind of helping paint that picture on the sponsor side of things. And then on the back end, I will say that, just because you have what seems like a bad budget to start with, it doesn't mean that you can't get to where you need to be. I've definitely had some surprising situations where initially I looked at the budget and thought, oh my gosh, this is, I don't know if we'll get to a reasonable budget. But then by having conversations and providing justifications, it is still possible to kind of get to where you need to be. So yeah, I would say kind of just doing your side, making sure you have a full understanding of the situation, and picking up the phone are keys there. Alex, you want to grab the next question?
Yeah, so we have a few that came in already from some familiar faces. The first one is, do you specialize in all kind of budgets, industry and non-industry funded? I will say that yes, we do. We have plenty of experience working on industry budgets, but also plenty of experience working on, government funded studies and the like. So yes, we do specialize in all kinds of studies and all kinds of budgets. The next one is how do you navigate having sponsors agree to use the facility budget template versus sponsor budget template? In my experience, I've never actually dealt with this situation, but what I can see or what I can imagine would be having the proper documentation or justification for why you would want to use the facility budget template versus sponsor budget template. I have seen from the CRO side that there are some sites that do use their own site budget templates, and so it's definitely a possibility. But navigating that, I would imagine that you would have to have the proper justification and documentation to back that up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the only thing I add there is, on the sponsor side, they might have some structure and things based on their payment system. So I think just having that conversation about your needs and being upfront so you can figure out a logical path forward. There's kind of two questions that are a little bit related, so I'm going to try to tackle them both at once. So one is about if we specialize in developing MCAs with guidelines-backed justification, and related question was from a small independent sites that hasn't been doing CAs. They've heard they're necessary, but they don't really understand in terms of the sponsor already providing a budget that marks standard of care items. So couple things there. So we do absolutely specialize in MCAs with guidelines, with back justifications. That is one of our other core services. And again, Alex and myself, we've done just about every indication type of trial. We've done the full gamut for a variety of sites. So we have a lot of expertise in terms of CAs. In terms of the broader question of why CAs and keeping that a little bit focused on topic today in terms of budgets and how that all ties together. So just really kind of quickly touching on the importance of CA from a billing compliance standpoint. So the big thing there with the CAs is identifying a payer, an appropriate payer for every item that's happening as part of the study. So with that, you want to prevent duplicate billing, which is unfortunately, there's been a lot of sites that are kind of commonly used as examples here of having received huge fines because they double bill. They bill the sponsor and insurance for the same item, which is very problematic. So you want to make sure that you have that clearly outlined in terms of who's paying for what. In terms of the sponsor being the one identifying standard of care items, I don't want to suggest at all this is ill-intended, but they don't necessarily have always the best understanding of that. And I mean, I would say too, of course, from their point of view, if they can mark more standard of care and they're not paying for it, they're motivated to do that versus on the site side, the motivation is to protect your site, to make sure that you're not going to get denials, that you have payments for things. So that's kind of one thing to consider with that. I would say another part of that is very much standard of care versus routine costs. Those are two different things. I mean, there's overlap, but standard of care, you're looking to your PI and their expertise of what would be clinically appropriate for that patient. Routine costs and where the coverage analysis is important is, you're looking at guidelines and, industry recommendations and peer-reviewed journals in terms of what would be appropriate for the patient. But there's another step of looking at the Medicare rules and regulations of, are they going to pay for that? Is that appropriate to bill Medicare? So making sure that you're doing that as part of the process. I would also say locally, your site may have certain policies or practices that you need to account for. There might be an LCD for your specific state for an item, and the sponsor's not going to be looking at it that way. So that's kind of the billing compliance part of it. But how that actually ties to the budget part is one, by appropriately identifying the payer for each item. If the sponsor does say it's standard of care and actually in looking at it, we disagree, it should be sponsor paid, you can update the sponsor budget to reflect that. The other part of it that a lot of sites maybe don't fully appreciate is that if you're just going off of the sponsor budget and maybe the schedule of events, again, not necessarily ill-intended, but I would say at least 80% of the time, if not more, you've missed items that you should be getting payment for because they're required as part of the study. We are almost always adding in items to the CA and to the budget that you that you should be factoring in to stay whole. So it's really all kind of part of the same process to some degree. Kind of our ideal workflow with that is doing the CA to build the internal budget to then work towards the negotiated sponsor budget. So it's all kind of one continuous process in a lot of ways.
Okay, we have another question here. What is the best practice for studies that are more than 3 years? Do you negotiate upfront a percentage increase year over year? Is it best to negotiate the entire budget all over in the fourth year? So there's a few different ways that you can go about this. One would be to include the percentage year over year increase within the budget. Or if if the sponsor is agreeable, you could renegotiate in the fourth year as well. But another option would be to build or figure out the percentage increase that you want. So say you want 4% year over year. Compare that to how many years the study is going to be conducted, and figure out the last cost, I guess, that's going to be in the last year of the study, and use that cost for the entire length of the study. Just to keep the cost consistent throughout the entire study. I think sponsors would be more agreeable to that as well. And within like a bottom line budget, you can obviously still do the percent increase year over year for your own reference. But in terms of transferring it over to the sponsor budget and getting that agreed upon, I think it would be a lot easier to have one consistent cost throughout the entire life of the study.
All right, I'll grab another question here. We are struggling with studies involving small device sponsors and their budgets. What are your recommendations? So this actually ties to some of the points that I made earlier, because when I see small device sponsor, one of the things I'm thinking about right away is limited funding. A lot of times they have this really novel and kind of, potentially beneficial device that they want to have studied, and they're just a small kind of startup company. So you're dealing with that. Another thing to think about there too, we've actually just recently had a trial like this where it's not only a small sponsor, it's a small sponsor that's EU based. And I say that because in terms of these smaller companies that don't quite have the experience and reach as some of the bigger companies, you might have to do some sponsor education. Not only in terms of understanding US costs and what's needed for sites to move forward, but also in terms of standard of care and what is an appropriate routine cost in a device trial. I've definitely had this conversation with sponsors more than once, trying to explain what CMS approval means. CMS approval for a IDE device study does not mean that CMS intends to pay for everything. If you look at Medicare Benefit Policy Manual Chapter 14, it's pretty explicit in saying that it's routine care items that would be otherwise available to Medicare beneficiaries, even if they weren't enrolled in a clinical trial. So that's where if you have a category A device, that's definitely more experimental by nature. But even a category B, I would, say is worth some caution. In terms of routine care items, you are looking for guideline recommendations on what the patients would have otherwise available. The category B does lend itself a bit by nature to being a bit less experimental. There's a lot of bits in terms of it being very gray. But yeah, you ultimately kind of want to make sure you're going through that process. And like I said, you might have to be explaining that to the sponsor, because in their mind, either the fact that they have CMS approval or the fact that it's a category B instantly means, well, Medicare is just going to pay for everything. And the other part of that too, when you're dealing with device trials, you're often dealing with not only expensive devices, expensive procedures, expensive imaging, and potentially hospitalization. And so when you're talking about a research DRG, and therefore everything happening during the hospitalization also needing to be research, that's going to add up quickly. And if that's not what the small sponsor was expecting, that's going to be a surprising lesson for them. Hopefully, by having things like this and having experts that you're working with, lots of sites are going to the sponsor and sharing this because, it's a different story if it's just one site raising this to the sponsor versus 10, then they might pay a little more attention versus just think you're hard to work with site or something. But, it's something that in terms of protecting your site, you do have to work with. And again, if you're changing what the sponsor believes to be mostly standard of care to a research DRG, I would absolutely pick up the phone and have that conversation and kind of explain where you're coming from, your concerns as a site, how you have to protect yourself, and work through all of that.
Okay, we have another question here. Do you think it's possible to charge the sponsor for mapping the site budget template to their templates, or maybe give them the option that the fee could be waived if they choose to negotiate using the site template? The mapping process can be rigorous, sometimes for multi-visits/cohort budgets. I definitely think it's possible. Again, you will need the documentation and the justification to back that up. I think if you could present it as giving them the option that the fee could be waived if they choose to negotiate using your own template, that's definitely a good option to give them. I don't think it would be very common for sponsors to agree to that, though. They are very set in their ways and using their own budgets. They would like to have their every site budget be the same for each study. But I could see a scenario where this could definitely help improve negotiations in terms of avoiding delays. I could also see how maybe just negotiating on a visit total basis and negotiating costs separately for like invoiceable items or startup fees or site admin fees. That's a good workaround for avoiding the rigorous process of editing a sponsored budget. I definitely think it's possible, but this is kind of new to me as well. But I could definitely see that sponsors being agreeable to this.
Yeah, makes sense. So we got another live question, and this is actually about train and build kind of specifically in the call an expert service, which I am happy to kind of explain that further. And the gist of the question is kind of, how informal or formal is it? What can I all ask? What can you help with? I would say what you're getting here live is what you would get on the phone. You can call us up and we're just here for whatever you need. Whether that's hey, I have this really hard CA question and I could just use talking through. Like I said, how we kind of envision the services for sites is very much how we operate internally. I was just mentioning this to someone the other day. I remember the first time years back when I saw my first cellular therapy trial. And I looked at it and I was like, what is this? Oh my God. Like it was just so mind blowing at the time and so, complicated. And so we were all in office at that time and I called someone over to talk and they were like, oh wow. And then I called over another person to talk. So it's really about that same kind of line of thinking of like, we very much appreciate, because this is how we operate internally, that you have questions and they could be completely random, this specific item or this general process or whatever, and you just want to talk to someone about it, and that's really the goal of the service, is just being available, whatever that means. There's not really an off limits question. It's literally just you call, you email, hey, I want to talk through this, I'm thinking about this, what are your thoughts on this? And we are here to collaborate, brainstorm, problem solve, give advice, whatever you're kind of looking for with that.
Yeah, we definitely want you to feel like we are an extension of your team. That's definitely our goal.
Yeah.
We have a question here. Do you think the internal budget should align with an itemized sponsor budget? In terms of the bottom line budget, not necessarily, but if you have an internal budget that is sort of like an internal negotiated budget that you are pulling costs over that you agree upon within the sponsor budget, I definitely think it should match. There are situations where it won't match because the sponsor may have some items in there that don't necessarily need to be within your budget, or you might have some items that you sort of combine into the sponsor budget. But I definitely think it should align just for consistency purposes, and so that where to allocate the funds and everything like that. I definitely think aligning them would be the best practice.
Yeah, agreed. I think there are times where as a site, maybe there's internal consideration that you'd want to add to yours just to kind of in terms of how you look at things with your metrics, your profit margin, or how you calculate, staff time for something. Certain there could be like a little extra to that, but yeah, in general, I think that definitely makes
Yeah,
sense.
one example that comes to mind is how typically in a sponsored budget they group a lot of like height, weight, and things like that to the physical exam. But internally, you might have actual cost for each of those specific items, but then when you transfer it over to the sponsored budget, you'll just combine them all into that one item so that you don't have to, redline and add new items into a sponsored budget that aren't necessarily necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, related question that we often get with the same line of thinking is for visit total budgets, which when you're getting a visit total budget, on the one hand, on the CA part of things, you might be thinking, I have to analyze everything, which you do. That is part of it. But in theory, for the negotiation part of it, it should lend itself to faster negotiations because there's less, you're not nitpicking item by item. But where people sometimes can get a little bit stuck with this is, I would say don't be afraid to ask the sponsor for, just like the very simple what they have calculated into the total. I would avoid the battle of, like you shouldn't, if you're doing a visit total negotiation, there should not be a need for you to provide the sponsor item by item, cost by cost. That negates the whole purpose of a visit total. But the sponsor generally, and there are some sponsors that I know offhand that are very willing to provide, they're like, this is what we just from a high level, the time points of what's built into the visit to help you understand if, for a certain visit, you're way far apart. Well, maybe it's because there's a scan that you analyzed and it's actually research, but they thought it'd be standard of care. So I just say, again, in terms of sponsor conversations and just trying to move forward efficiently, don't be afraid to do that. But that is an area too where it's, of course, you're not going to quite line up with them necessarily, but there are ways to kind of have that conversation to make sure you're speaking, apples to apples without doing all the work of an itemized budget.
Yeah, personally, I like the visit total budgets, but there are situations where we are so far off that we do need to take a closer look at what the sponsor is actually budgeting. And it usually comes down to what they're considering routine care and what we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of want to sidetrack, so I'll grab another questions here. So what are your thoughts on master budget agreements / rate cards? To me, this is a very, it depends situation. It's not black and white. It's not a simple, yes, always do it. No, never do it. It really, I think is something that, is worth thinking about on a sponsor by sponsor basis. Of course, there are benefits if you have a sponsor you're regularly working with. If you have a master agreement and you don't have to every time negotiate the same things, definitely a huge benefit to that. But I would say even then, there's some things to think through. Is your master agreement just for administrative fees? And you feel comfortable with those fees being the fees or your cost for the next 5 years or however long the agreement lasts for? Versus are there some CPT coded items that exams, CBCs, kind of super common items that you want to put in there and that the sponsor also has the appetite to have in there. Another consideration too is mirroring studies. So you do always have that option, whether or not you have a master agreement, to leverage a recently negotiated budget and just let the sponsor know, hey, in the name of doing this as efficiently as possible, we copied over the cost from this study to this one so we don't have to renegotiate. Most of the time sponsors are pretty fine with that. I've had some weird situations where a sponsor will come back and say something like, well, that was for a different department and they have different funding, which, right away to me, it doesn't change the site's, CT x-ray costs. It's the same cost. It didn't magically change for a different department. So, I just say that to say that, you could still run into issues if you're just trying to mirror versus having that set standardized. It's just a given. If you have a nice sponsor, they already built it into the budget before they send it to you because they know. So there's definitely benefits with that. If you have CPT code items in there, again, making sure that you're accounting for inflation and you're comfortable living with those costs for however long the agreement goes for. And then I would say just kind of understanding your pipeline as well. Are you working on a master agreement and your studies are pretty, far down the process and you don't have new studies coming up with a sponsor? So maybe you're, doing all this work and not getting a lot of benefit out of it. Versus if we have several studies in the near future with a sponsor, so we're definitely going to be utilizing this. And then the last consideration I'd throw out there is just in terms of the sponsor. I won't name names in this call, but we all know there's some sponsors that are amazing to work with and some that are pretty challenging and it's hard to get to a reasonable budget. So, if you think about your amazing sponsors, master agreement might be a pretty easy thing to negotiate. Versus the more challenging ones. I mean, I could actually argue both sides of that. They're hard to negotiate, therefore a master agreement would have even more benefit, or they're hard to negotiate. Think about how long it took you to negotiate one study, now times 10 maybe for a master agreement, because they're more motivated to, to control costs with that. So so I think, it's definitely, if you can make it make sense, of course, it's going to speed up your timelines and be beneficial, but a lot to consider with that.
We have a question here. Nicole, you might need to help me with this one a little bit, but if a trial has received CMS approval on an IDE trial, does this approval trump an active LCD in place? I don't believe so. I think that, the approval would apply just to the device itself, and you would still need to analyze all the items and services, procedures, independently of that to make sure that they're still routinely, performed outside of a trial. So I don't think that would trump an active LCD.
Yeah, and just kind of going off the things I was mentioning earlier, how I would think about CMS approval is if you have an IDE device study and the sponsor has elected not to get CMS approval, which sometimes they don't do if they, in their mind, they don't think the Medicare population is impacted, or it's a category A study and so they're planning on paying for it. Really, the CMS approval is sort of it's a key part of the qualification for the device study. So if you think about NC 310.1 and the steps needed there for a qualifying trial, for the trial to be qualifying for an IDE, you want that FDA approval letter and that CMS approval letter. And that just means then that routine costs can be billed within that trial. But you're still, if there's an LCD limiting an item, it's still limited. And it's something that Medicare beneficiaries outside the trial cannot have access to. So you still have to go through kind of the normal processes. It's not a blanket approval that they're providing. It's just kind of saying from here, if it is routine, you can bill, versus if you don't have that CMS approval, sponsor should be planning on paying for all of it because you cannot bill Medicare. Okay. Looking through the other questions we have here. Let's see. So many times sponsors bundle the time and effort items in the budget. Since we have costs associated, we do need to itemize to ensure the costs offered by the sponsor covers our costs. But also when we build the calendar in Encore, that does need to match the data that is entered into the EDC. So I think this gets into the conversation maybe a little bit before in terms of internal budget matching sponsor budget. And it's really coming down to making the documents work in terms of the full picture of things. So maybe, and this is something that, site by site, depending on what specifically you need out of the process, you might do it a little bit differently. But I would say if in your internal budget, you really need to have, like let's say we have 3 different time and effort items, and you really need to understand, what we're budgeting for each of those items, that's totally fine. And you can try to change the sponsor budget to account for those separate items. Some sponsors will say no, because of, like you were kind of mentioning, EDC considerations, how we pay out blah, blah, blah. They don't want to add in new items, but they can account for all those costs together in one line. And you can even try to make that clear then of like, this line includes X, Y, and Z. So there's ways to work through that. So maybe in the sponsor budget, it's, $100, but in yours, it's 25, 25, and 50 for your kind of internal understanding purposes. And then in terms of, your CTMS and kind of building that out and matching the sponsor budget in terms of how you're going to get paid or how you need to invoice and thinking through that. So it might not be always a one-to-one-to-one, but just kind of trying to, to me, in terms of the internal budget, you want to capture what internally as an institution you need to understand about your financial metrics. As much as possible, you do want to marry that to the sponsor budget, to the CTMS, things like that. But of course, there's going to be some limitations and things that you kind of have to think through sort of trial by trial.
Let's see here. We had a question from before, what kind of insights can you share working from the CRO sponsor side of things? One of the big things that I remember from still working on the site side is that the term FMV was thrown around a lot, and I know some of you may cringe at hearing that, but getting the perspective from the CRO side about how they actually come up with that FMV gave me a good understanding of how to negotiate based on that. What they do is they pull, the indication, the phase, the procedure, and the associated costs to create a range of amounts that the sponsors can sort of expect that the majority of sites will accept. The problem with fair market value is that it's a lagging indicator. So all the data that they're pulling from is from previous years, previous studies, and if you reevaluate costs, especially considering inflation, they're always going to increase either on a quarterly or a yearly basis. So that does make negotiating very difficult when they have FMV that's a year or so old, especially when you're joining a study that was started a few years ago. They're probably using a template with FMV that was calculated more than a few years ago. So they could be very out of date in terms of the cost that they would expect sites to accept. But to counteract that, you definitely need to have the justification that goes along with the cost that you're requesting. Another issue is that fair market value is sort of an incomplete process. The sponsors sort of get a holistic view of the potential requests that would come from sites, but it doesn't factor in the actual site that they're negotiating with. It's sort of like a one-size-fits-all approach, and that could definitely lend to having some issues down the road where there's escalations that need to occur and things like that. So I think just factoring that into the negotiating process, understanding that the costs that they're working with are sort of outdated. Having justification behind your costs is definitely best practice.
All right, grab another question here. What is the benefit of working with outside companies on budgets? So I will answer this from our perspective as Elevate in terms of kind of why clients partner with us, and it goes back to kind of some of the points I was making earlier. Is it really depends on sites' goals, challenges, needs, and how that most makes sense for them. I would say in terms of kind of some of the big ones. So flexibility is definitely one of them. Going back to kind of a hybrid model, sites might have a lot of fluctuation in their study volume. So you could have a month where you really need 5 budget analysts to keep up, and some months where it's, or most months, maybe it's just 2. So you could hire 5 and not have enough work for them, or you could hire 3 and have months where they're just far behind, overworked, etc. Or you could hire 2 and give your overflow of studies to Elevate. to kind of help support and kind of keep things level. And with that, then, keep turnaround times under control, prevent a backlog, things like that. So that's one part of it. Another part of it, and it kind of ties into call an expert and things like that, is just having expert support. One of our VPs of business development likes to call it salty veterans, which I try not to take offense to. I think she said it with love, but it's just, having people that have been there, done that, have tons of experience, have insight that they can share. We commonly get questions that are to the effect of, what are other sites doing? And of course, we're not sharing client specifics, but we can say at a broad level, this is what we commonly see. Alex with his sponsor experience can say, oh, the sponsor, I've commonly seen him accept it this way, things like that. So we have a lot of insight that we can provide. Some sites, want to use this for their really challenging studies when you get the new cellular therapy or a new device or things like that. So that's kind of a way that we provide support. In terms of standardizing and streamlining processes, we definitely have a couple of institutions we're talking to that have completely decentralized processes. So they're looking for someone to help guide that, so they can streamline, become more efficient, and then also at the same time kind of process improve. When we start working with clients, what we like to do is kind of take a lay of the land with them and kind of just offer up suggestions, potential process improvements, and collaborate. It's ultimately the site's decision, and you guys are the experts on your own sites, but we can, share our experience, share potential suggestions, things like that. And then, yeah, just in terms of, things changing, having challenging situations, new things coming up. I think a lot of the sites we work with just appreciate kind of having the outside perspective on things, and someone to talk through these kind of items.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is like the visibility that we have. We're working on a number of studies, indications, guidelines, anything. We've seen all the budget templates through all the sponsors. So something that may be new to you might not be new to us, and so that's why we're here to help.
Absolutely. I think we have time for just a couple more questions here. Let's see. I can grab this one. It's actually kind of related to what I was just talking about a little bit in terms of being a decentralized site. So we are a decentralized site with each institution currently operating independently. What would you recommend in terms of finding ways to standardize the process while keeping in mind necessary location/indication differences? So yeah, this is definitely something that we've talked to several sites about in terms of trying to achieve that. To me, the big thing is, if you're looking at it in terms of a comprehensive approach, I don't think it's an either or. I think you can get sort of the best of both worlds, or kind of what you need from both aspects of it, and combine it into one. So where and how we kind of have these conversations with the institutions in terms of those streamlined processes, where does that make sense, in terms of some of the admin fees or how you're pricing certain procedures or things. There's going to be commonalities that exist amongst all the different locations, departments, however you're kind of divided out, that would make sense to kind of look at as a whole process, not only in terms of streamlining how you're doing things today, but also in terms of, like I was kind of referring to before, process improvement conversations, kind of taking that look of, how are we doing things, where can we improve upon it, and even just thinking about the sponsor side of things, when they're working with whatever your site name is, whether it's this location, that location, they're oftentimes looking at it as just the site. They're not thinking about you separately necessarily. So there's going to be commonalities. But at the same time, of course, if you have a cardiology device study versus a cellular therapy study, there are very different costs that need to be factored in, not only admin fees, per patient budget fees. There's a lot of nuance in terms of capturing those particularities. So, you can do it in a way that still keeps that understood in terms of, these are our sort of general processes. These are where we have overlap and where it makes sense to standardize what we're doing. But when you get a cardiology device study, you also have to factor in these items. And I'd say another part of that, just in terms of conversations that we've had that sites have found helpful, is, if parts of sites are truly separate and operating completely independently, it could be that, this part of the site has some really great best practices that the other part has no idea about, because they've never actually had that conversation and kind of mapped it all out and learn from each other in that way. So it's not only us kind of helping share our knowledge and potential areas of improvements, but sites can learn from each other and help streamline things that way as well. So I think there's certainly ways to look big picture at that, and not lose the nuances of different studies and indications and things like that.
Okay, we got another question. We know there are other clients who may be on the same studies we're on. Do you all use a general template for those protocols and customize from there based upon client needs, or are new eyes on each request that comes in? I will say that we definitely take from what we've learned completing different studies or the same studies for a different client. But we do get fresh eyes on each study that comes in, each request that comes in, because there could be differences based on site-specific policies or LCDs even. The amendments could come in, anything like that. So we definitely pull from our experience, but we still put fresh eyes on that just to make sure we're covering all our bases.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's an area where, in terms of efficiencies, we can bring something to the table if it's something that we've already worked through and maybe we already learned something in terms of the budget. We're going to apply that knowledge broadly. But yeah, like Alex was saying, it's always a site-specific solution, because you might have site policies, certain things that we need to kind of factor in. So it's definitely not cookie cutter, but at the same time, it's leveraging, that broader knowledge for sure.
Mhm.
Okay. So question on the training process. What does your training process for budgets look like? This is something that we could probably, maybe that's our next webinar topic. We could have a long conversation about this internally for us and what it looks like for clients. So just quickly internally for us, I will say a nice part about working at Elevate is, when we take on new people, it's individuals like Alex who comes fully equipped, ready to go, more or less. So it's kind of meeting people where they are. I think there's, and even for myself though, it's something where I think that's kind of for, at least for me, a benefit of this is we're always learning, we're always pushing our knowledge, we're always going to conferences, things like that. So there's always a lot to learn, even if you are a seasoned expert on things. But I think with the budget part of things, for us, there's a lot to understand, because we have, again, that kind of broad industry best practice knowledge that we bring to the table for sites. We have site assigned experts that are going to, know all the site policies, nuances, things to consider. So there's kind of that part of things. But then just in terms of the budget process in general, going back to the CA part of things, to me, it's pretty challenging to do a budget if you don't understand CAs or the larger picture of things. So there's kind of factoring in that. There's, the negotiation part of things, which is, part art, part science a little bit. There's the payment terms. So there's a lot that goes into it. But in terms of kind of how that translates for sites and training, again, a big part of that is meeting sites where they are. So maybe you have a pretty new and experienced team. Maybe you have a mostly experienced team, but you could just kind of use some process refinement, kind of getting to the next level, standardizing in terms of your materials, things like that. So it's kind of working with sites to kind of first get that understanding. From there, working on a customized approach in terms of what you need, your goals, the materials, things like that. Doing the training can look a lot of different ways, again, depending on what the sites are looking for in terms of, we have a very immediate need and we want to accelerate the program and do it, more intensively in terms of hours and in a shorter amount of time, versus it's not, a crisis level kind of thing. And we'd rather not disrupt operations. Let's do this kind of more gradually over a period of time. So that's all very much part of the conversation of, developing the training, even in terms of modalities and structure with the sites to make sure that makes sense. So yeah, there's a lot of customization that can go along with that. So I think we got one more question here, maybe. Oh no, that was the one that we just answered. Yeah, and actually it's perfect timing. So we are getting a little bit short on time here. I think we grabbed most of the live questions. If we missed one, feel free to reach out and let us know. I do just kind of want to wrap things up with a couple quick slides here. First and foremost, I wanted to mention our hero community, and I love Katie, our marketing person, for finding this photo. I think it's fantastic. And it kind of helps reinforce the general idea of, I think one of the glimmers of positive during COVID is healthcare workers finally got their dues, in terms of being seen as the heroes they are. And clinical research, you got on top of, regular day-to-day clinical responsibilities, all the complication that comes with clinical trials, the paperwork, the everything, all the extra work, and then just kind of, big picture in terms of helping advance medicine, getting treatments to patients that otherwise don't have it. For us, it's, this is why I think Alex and I love working with sites, is we do see you guys as heroes. And if we have even the tiniest part of that, we feel truly honored. HERO stands for Helping Elevate Research Operations. If you go to our website, which is noted here, in community resources, you'll see our hero community. It is in its infancy currently, but we have big plans with it. So we would encourage you to sign up today and more to come. But if you go there today, you'll find white papers. This webinar, when we're done, will live there as well if you want to reference it in the future. We have plans underway currently for a discussion board. So the idea there is that sites can come in, pose a question, have some experts from Elevate respond, hopefully have other sites respond. We really want this to be sort of a by sites, for sites community where you can, speak to each other, kind of see what other sites are doing on various questions you may have. It's something that, if you have thoughts on what could be helpful for this, please let us know. Like I said, I want it to be truly a helpful community, recognize sites as the heroes as they are, and kind of have that goal of, just helping in terms of operations, efficiencies, helping everyone succeed in the greater name of, patients and all of that. So please do sign up. Please do give us suggestions. More to come in terms of our hero community. And then just to kind of wrap things up really quick on train and build, hopefully you got a little bit of a glimpse in terms of working with Alex and I in terms of having kind of ongoing support. We do really aim to meet sites where they are and how we can best help, in terms of training and potentially doing more of a hybrid model if you're looking to do some of the services internally, and providing a cost-effective investment with that, and doing things in a site-focused way. So not giving you cookie cutter, this is how Elevate says you have to do a CA, partnering, giving suggestions, but looking at how you're doing things today, giving you your own playbook, your own training materials that's site focused, to make sure that it makes sense for you, and just kind of being there to lend guidance, support along the way. So with that, thank you all so much for attending. We are really excited to kick off this train and build series. This is the first one. Stay tuned in terms of schedule from here. Other sessions, we are still planning that out as well. So if I haven't made it clear, I love feedback. So if there's something that you want to have seen covered, whether it's kind of high level train and build ideas of how do we get knowledge, how do I assess my team's knowledge on CAs, we can talk about that, or maybe we'll do another call an expert, but we'll talk about CAs or contracts. Still planning, would love to get your feedback. I'll end here in terms of our contact information, how you can reach out to us. But yeah, thanks again. We're really excited to kick this off and to continue the conversation, and appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully it was helpful, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.